Welcome once again to the 2018 facelift of the Mahindra XUV500. Now I know we've reviewed this car once before, but two things are different this time around. For one, we are on the public road rather than the confines of Mahindra's testing facility. And two, whereas in the past we've always tested a diesel version of this car, for the first time ever, this is the petrol version of the XUV500. Now this is uncharted territory both for Mahindra and for us, so we really cannot wait to see what it's like from behind the wheel. Now what do you think of the XUV500 petrol? Would you buy one? Would you choose the diesel version instead, or would you have another car altogether? Let us know in the comments, and be sure to like and subscribe and click the bell icon to get notified every time we upload a new video. Now we already told you about the XUV's new look in our last video review of the facelifted version, so we won't get into it in detail this time. Personally, I like the more mature styling, both at the front and the rear. What's important to note is this petrol XUV isn't the top spec version, so it misses things like the chrome strips on the doors and the new 18-inch alloy wheels. It sticks with 17 inches instead. The back seat remains unchanged, and as before, there is loads of space back here. There's a third row too, but there really isn't much space there. And plus, if you do use the seats, the boot is reduced to almost nothing. So unless you're in a pinch, it's probably better to keep them folded. The XUV's cabin, like the exterior design, has come a long way since the original, both in its look as well as quality. Materials are better. For the most part, it's not as rough around the edges, and I really like the new glossy black finish on the center console. But there are also some annoying idiosyncrasies. The gear selector is tricky to slot, especially in and out of reverse. The odd handbrake, as ever, looks like it's been bent out of shape. There's an AC vent pointed directly at your foot that doesn't shut off when you shut it off. And the brake pedal on this car, well, it's loose, and that is scary. It's these little things that tinge an otherwise much improved car. Still, I do like the front seats, which, since the petrol is not a top spec car, come in a tasteful textured fabric finish rather than the quilted leather. That's right, the petrol XUV comes in only a single trim, G, which in terms of equipment sits between the diesel's W7 and W9 middle variants. So you do miss out on leather seats, a powered driver's seat, a sunroof and a rear view camera, to name a few, but as you can see, you still get quite a lot. But really, this being the first time a petrol engine has ever featured in this car, like I said at the start, I'm keen to know about how it drives. So, let me tell you a little bit about this engine. It uses the same 2179cc capacity as its diesel counterpart, and let's just say I don't think that's a coincidence. And that means it's a nice large engine, no downsizing here. It is, however, also turbocharged, and that should mean a hefty power output, right? Well, no actually. This engine makes 140 horsepower, which for a petrol engine that's turbocharged of this size is really not a lot at all. The Jeep Compass, for instance, makes more than that from a 1.4 litre engine. However, where that large capacity petrol engine and the turbocharger come together on the spec sheet is the torque figure, 320 Newton meters. That's a lot. Now, one of the reasons you choose a petrol engine over its diesel counterpart is refinement, and yes, I have to say it is more refined than the diesel version. Especially at idle, it's really quite silent. However, by petrol engine standards, it is quite noisy. It's okay again at low revs, just over idle, but the moment you touch the accelerator pedal, it gets quite boomy inside the cabin. You have to feather the throttle to make silent and smooth progress. The moment you floor it or even go at half throttle, it gets really noisy. The advantage of this engine's large size as compared to a downsized, smaller capacity engine is that off boost, it doesn't feel lacking in power, so you always get this strong hit of power as soon as you tap the throttle, and that's before the turbo has even come on. In fact, it is at low revs where this engine does its best work. Once you get past about 2000 RPM, the rate of power build kind of slows down and it feels really strained as you go up the rev range. The power band itself is really short and fat, so it comes in a big lump and then it goes away really quickly. In fact, it's redlined at just 5000 RPM. Are we sure this is not a diesel? We tested the XUV Petrol for performance, and while initial responses are good, its 0 to 100 time of 12.77 seconds is just about average. And interestingly, it's exactly the same as the diesel. It does, however, perform pretty decently in kickdown acceleration. Now the Petrol XUV500 is front-wheel drive only. There's no all-wheel drive on this version. And with all that torque going through the front wheels, you would expect a bit of torque steer. And yes, there is some, but it's rather impressively contained. If you flatten your foot, you will feel the steering wheel firm up in your hands. But it's only when you're on an adverse surface that you feel some actual torque steer and the car pulling to another direction. At the moment, the XUV Petrol is only available as an automatic, and just like the diesel, it uses a 6-speed torque converter gearbox. Now there's no sport mode or paddle shifters behind the steering wheel, but you can shift using a tiny little switch on the gear lever, which is a bit awkward. It's a smooth shifting gearbox, I'll give it that, and when you pair it with a light throttle, it goes about its business without any fuss. Which is just as well, because in the same way that this engine doesn't like to be revved hard, the gearbox doesn't like to be pushed hard either. It does its best work when you drive in a relaxed manner. Oh, and of course, this is an SUV with a large capacity petrol engine and a turbocharger. So you can only imagine what the fuel consumption is like. We haven't had a chance to put it against our testing equipment to do an official fuel economy test, but let's just say I've only been on this shoot for a couple of hours and the bars are dropping quite rapidly. Apart from that, the driving experience is as you remember. The steering is quick enough but just a little bit lifeless. The ride is a bit firm and a bit lumpy, and it does crash through bumps, but body control and agility is really rather good. At 15.5 lakh rupees ex-showroom, the XUV500 Petrol still represents excellent value for money. Now I know it's not the top spec version, but you still get a lot of stuff with this car, not to mention the size and space on offer. We would recommend the petrol version if you plan to use it primarily in the city because, well, it works best at low engine loads and at low speeds, and I don't think you'd want to live with the fuel bills of this car over long distances. It's also probably cleaner than the diesel version and it's a bit more refined too. However, if those two things are not a top priority for you, we would still recommend sticking with the diesel version as A, there's a lot more variety, and B, it's just a better all-round car.